The confession came quietly, almost as if Dylan himself could barely bear to hear the words leaving his own lips. The sound of his voice trembled against the sterile air of the hospital corridor, and for a brief moment, even the world seemed to still. He said he was the one who caused the accident, that it was his car that struck Luna that night. The guilt had been eating him alive, twisting through his nerves like electricity. Will stood frozen, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality unfolding in front of him, while Electra's heart lurched between disbelief and dread. The tragedy that had shattered their lives now had a name, but the confession didn't bring closure. It only opened the door to something darker, more intricate, and far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. For days after Dylan's admission, the atmosphere around Spencer Publications was thick with unease. Bill had gone silent, his face unreadable as he stared out over the city's skyline from his office, the empire he had built gleaming beneath the morning sun. But beneath that steel calm lay fury, a father's fury, a businessman's fury, the kind of rage that seeks answers not through emotion but through precision. Luna had not just been a casualty of fate. She was part of something larger, something that now seemed to bleed into the very foundations of the power structures in Los Angeles. Will and Electra felt it too. Dylan's story didn't add up. His words felt rehearsed, his guilt almost too clean, too deliberate. There was something in his eyes, fear, yes, but not only that. There was the silent desperation of someone being watched, someone cornered into saying exactly what they were told to say. The night Luna died had always been shrouded in inconsistencies. Witnesses contradicted each other, camera footage had mysteriously vanished, and the vehicle that hit her seemed to disappear for hours before it was eventually found abandoned near Mulholland Drive. Dylan claimed he panicked, that he left the car out of fear, that he didn't remember much after the crash. But Will, whose sharp instincts had been honed from growing up under Bill Spencer's shadow, felt something pulling at the edges of the truth. Electra, still grieving the loss of the only woman who had ever made her feel understood, refused to let it end there. Together, they began to retrace Luna's final movements, piecing together the fragments left behind. It started with something small, a single receipt found in Luna's apartment, dated the night before her death. It was from a cafe near the Forrester building, a place she rarely visited. The name written at the bottom of the bill wasn't hers. It was Dylan's. But what unsettled Will and Electra most was the timestamp. An hour after Luna had already texted Dylan saying she didn't want to see him anymore. Had he followed her there? Or had someone else forged the encounter? When they confronted Dylan, his reaction was instantaneous. His hands trembled, his eyes darted around the room, and for a moment, Will thought he saw pure terror flash across his face. He mumbled something about not remembering and then begged them to stop digging. That was when Will knew they were no longer just chasing the truth. They were trespassing into someone's design. Rumors had long swirled through Los Angeles' elite about secret deals, shadow negotiations, and buried scandals linking Forrester Creations and Spencer Publications. Both empires had thrived on perfection, beautiful facades that hid darker truths. Luna, in her short but brilliant time as a designer, had been working on a confidential project that bridged the two companies. It was meant to be a collaboration that could reshape the industry, a sustainable couture line uniting Forrester craftsmanship with Spencer's global reach. But what no one knew was that Luna had stumbled onto something in the process. She had discovered financial irregularities, documents that hinted at money being siphoned through shell companies, perhaps even through someone close to both families. When Will and Electra began to dig deeper into Luna's files, they found a hidden folder on her laptop, encrypted but not beyond Will's technical skill. What they uncovered wasn't just business misconduct, it was a blueprint for manipulation. Emails, contracts, and coded memos all pointed to a mysterious figure referred to only as Z. This person had been orchestrating moves behind the scenes, influencing Dylan, Luna, and even board members from both corporations. And in one chilling message, dated 2 days before Luna's death, E had written, "The girl is getting too close. Handle it before she talks." Electra's breath caught when she read it. She turned to Will, eyes wide with realization and horror. Whoever this he was, they had not only silenced Luna, but had done so using Dylan as the perfect pawn. Dylan wasn't a monster, he was a scapegoat. Someone had known his weaknesses, his loyalty to Luna, and his guilt over their strained relationship. That guilt had been weaponized. He had been manipulated into believing the accident was his fault, perhaps through planted evidence or suggestive conditioning. It was the perfect crime, messy enough to seem human, tragic enough to end sympathy. As Will and Elektra followed the trail, each step brought them closer to the underbelly of power they had always been protected from. They discovered that Dylan had been receiving anonymous payments into an untraceable account, disguised as consulting fees. The transactions originated from a holding company tied indirectly to both Forrester and Spencer Investments, a financial intersection so complex it could only have been built by someone with deep insider knowledge. Someone who could manipulate both sides without ever being suspected. Someone who had something to lose if Luna's project went public. Will's suspicion shifted from disbelief to obsession. He began to see patterns everywhere, in the company memos, in the way certain executives avoided eye contact, even in how his father reacted when Luna's name was mentioned. Bill Spencer had been protective of her, almost paternal at times, and her death had affected him more deeply than he let on. But what if Bill himself had been a target too? What if someone wanted to fracture the alliance between Spencer and Forrester, using Luna's death as the wedge? The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. Strange things began happening. Emails disappearing from their inboxes, their phones glitching, shadows trailing them when they left the office. One night, after leaving a late meeting, Elektra found her car tires slashed. The message was clear: stop asking questions. But instead of fear, it only fueled her determination. She remembered Luna's words from weeks before the accident. If anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll look past what they tell you. At the time, it had sounded paranoid. Now it felt prophetic. It was Elektra who eventually uncovered the connection that would blow everything open. She discovered that one of the Forrester financial consultants who had worked with Luna's team was actually a front for an external contractor, a discreet strategist known for corporate sabotage and insider manipulation. His name appeared in old Spencer files under another alias. And when Will cross-referenced that alias through private databases, one name emerged from the shadows: Justin Barber. Once Bill Spencer's trusted ally, Justin had disappeared from the public eye years ago after their falling out, a betrayal that left scars on both men. But in the shadows of Los Angeles business, he had reinvented himself, building a quiet empire of manipulation. He had connections in both fashion and media, and he had the means to orchestrate a tragedy that would cripple both Forrester and Spencer at once. By using Dylan, a vulnerable, remorseful young man, Justin could craft a believable accident that masked a corporate assassination. Luna had to die not because she was weak but because she knew too much. The revelation shattered Dylan. When Will and Elektra confronted him with the evidence, he broke down completely. He confessed that someone had been guiding him in the weeks before the crash, sending cryptic messages, feeding him lies about Luna meeting another man, driving him into a jealous rage. On the night of the accident, he'd received a text telling him Luna was leaving town to expose something that would ruin them all. Blinded by emotion, he had gone after her. But what he hadn't known was that his brakes had been tampered with long before he started the car. He had never stood a chance. He was as much a victim as Luna herself. Will could hardly breathe as the full picture came together. The accident had not been an act of passion. It was murder disguised as chaos. And Justin Barber, the man once closest to his father, had orchestrated it to destroy both the Forresters' reputation and Bill's financial empire. By making it look like a scandalous tragedy, a designer dead, her lover guilty, and two powerful families at war, Justin had nearly succeeded in his revenge. But the truth, once unearthed, refused to stay buried. Will and Elektra took the evidence to Bill, who sat in silence as the files loaded on the screen. For the first time in years, the infamous media titan looked shaken. He had built his life on controlling narratives, but this one had unfolded right under his nose. His expression darkened with a fury that chilled the room. He wanted to break me, Bill murmured, his voice low. So he killed her. In the days that followed, the fallout was explosive. Justin's network of shell companies collapsed under federal investigation, his connections across fashion and publishing dragged into the light. Dylan, though still consumed by guilt, was exonerated publicly, his name cleared through Will's tireless work. Yet absolution did not erase the scars. He withdrew from the spotlight, his eyes hollow with the weight of what he'd lost. Electra visited him once, and for a long time they said nothing. Grief had changed them both, burned away innocence, leaving only truth. Will, meanwhile, found himself at a crossroads. Exposing Justin had brought justice, but it had also exposed a deeper rot within the world he came from, a world where loyalty was conditional and beauty often masked corruption. Forrester Creations and Spencer Publications both issued statements mourning Luna, but behind the polished words was the quiet recognition that their dynasties had survived by the narrowest margin. And Will, though still his father's son, now carried a piece of that darkness with him. At Luna's memorial, held beneath the pale light of sunset, Electra placed a single white orchid on the podium. The flower Luna had once said symbolized resilience. The crowd was silent, the air heavy with remorse and revelation. As Will watched the petals tremble in the breeze, he realized the truth was not an ending. It was the beginning of something else, an awakening. Because now he knew how easily lies could be spun into truth, how power could rewrite morality, and how even love could be weaponized in the wrong hands. And somewhere, far from the ceremony, Justin Barber sat in a holding cell, a faint smirk curving his lips. He had lost his freedom, but not his satisfaction. He had wanted to expose the fragility of their perfect worlds, to prove that beneath every empire of glass and gold lay cracks waiting to split open. And, in a way, he had succeeded. The world now saw the Forrestos and the Spencers not as untouchable icons, but as flawed mortals. He had taken their illusion and shattered it. But what he hadn't foreseen was what came next, the quiet strength that rose from the ashes. Will and Electra vowed to finish Luna's project, to bring her sustainable fashion vision to life, not as a brand, but as a movement. It would be her legacy, and their redemption. And as the first designs came to life, each stitch became a promise that truth, once found, could be transformed into something beautiful. In the end, Dylan's confession had been only the spark. The true fire had always been hidden beneath, the fire of greed, vengeance, and secrets too dangerous to remain buried. Yet from that fire came renewal, proof that even in a world built on deception, truth could still burn bright enough to cleanse. And in that light, beneath the hum of sewing machines and the whisper of silk, the spirit of Luna lived on, eternal, unbroken, and finally free. The late December sunlight fell through the glass walls of Forrester Creations, muted and heavy, like the weight of unspoken truths pressing against the air. In that light, Ridge Forrester stood at the edge of his father's design studio, surrounded by decades of legacy, rolls of silk, sketches pinned with precision, patterns cut by hands that had shaped an empire. But what once felt like the heart of beauty now felt like the heart of decay. Eric Forrester, the patriarch whose name commanded reverence, was fading before Ridge's eyes, yet not in body alone. Something deeper, a quiet unraveling of purpose, had begun. Ridge told himself he was protecting his father, saving him from exhaustion, from relapse, from death. But deep down, another voice whispered, he was saving himself. Eric sat across the room, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted a pencil on his drafting table. The faint sound of graphite against paper echoed through the studio, like the scratching of time itself. He could feel Ridge's presence hovering, protective and suffocating in equal measure. Every time he looked up, he saw not the pride of a son but the pity of a caretaker. That look cut deeper than illness ever could. Once, Ridge had been the eager apprentice who marveled at his father's talent. Now he was the reluctant warden, policing the limits of a dying man. Eric could not decide which was worse, the fragility of his own body or the slow erosion of his dignity. In the world outside their walls, Forrester Creations gleamed with vitality, but inside, a silent war was being fought over its soul. Ridge believed that to love his father meant to restrain him. He had seen how close Eric came to death last time, the way his breathing had slowed, his heartbeat faltering beneath hospital lights. That memory haunted him, a phantom he could not silence. And so, each time Eric reached for his sketchbook or spoke of returning to couture design, Ridge intervened, his voice gentle but firm. "You've done enough," he would say, unaware that these words sliced like blades. Because to a man like Eric, enough was never a measure of safety, it was a declaration of exile. The tension between them had become a quiet poison. Eric spent more time alone, lost in sketches that no one else saw. His mind, though fogged by illness, remained sharp enough to perceive what his son could not admit, that Ridge's care had turned into control, that beneath his love was a shadow of resentment. Ridge had always lived under the weight of Eric's brilliance, and now, perhaps unconsciously, he wanted to replace it with his own authority. He didn't mean to hurt his father, but every decision made for his own good chipped away at the man Eric used to be. Ridge was trying to save him, yet with every act of protection, he was killing him slowly, not with cruelty, but with concern. Steffi Forrester, meanwhile, found herself caught in the crossfire between two generations of men she loved. When she returned to Los Angeles, the atmosphere inside the Forrester home felt different, dense, quiet, full of unspoken fears. She saw how Ridge hovered over his father, how Eric's spark dimmed each time Ridge entered the room. It reminded her of something she couldn't bear to name, the look of a man preparing to surrender. She refused to accept it. One night, as the tension reached its breaking point, she turned to Finn, seeking the one space where she could let her guard fall. Finn listened as Steffi spoke, her voice trembling, her words rushing out in fragments. She talked about her grandfather not as the titan of fashion but as the man who had guided her through childhood, who taught her that art was not about perfection but about courage. It was Eric who had told her that creation was an act of defiance, a refusal to accept limits. And now, that same man was being confined by the son he raised to believe in freedom. The contradiction tore at her. She loved Ridge deeply, understood his fear of losing their patriarch again, but she could not ignore that in his fear, he was repeating history, doing to Eric what Eric had once done to him. In the stillness of their bedroom, Finn placed his hand over hers, grounding her. He had seen it too, though from a doctor's perspective rather than a family member's. Eric's body was failing, yes, but his mind still fought fiercely for purpose. Finn had watched patients live longer when given meaning, and he feared that taking that away from Eric would do what disease could not, drain his will to live. "He doesn't need saving," Finn said softly. "He needs permission to live the way he wants." The words stayed with Steffi long after. The next day, she returned to the mansion. The air smelled faintly of cedarwood and linen, the scent of Eric's past glories lingering like a ghost. She found him seated by the window, sketchbook in his lap, his lines tentative but alive. When he looked up, his eyes softened at the sight of her. She did not need to speak. He knew why she was there. She could see the unspoken question in his gaze. "Do you think I'm finished?" And she could not bring herself to answer. Instead, she knelt beside him and studied his drawings. They were unlike anything she had seen before, abstract, emotional, almost haunting. It was as if he were sketching fragments of himself, pieces of a legacy he feared losing. Meanwhile, Ridge stood in the conference room of Forrester Creations, surrounded by designs from the younger team. He told himself he was building the future, that his father's methods were relics of another age. But even as he spoke about innovation, something inside him felt hollow. He missed the sound of Eric's voice cutting through creative debates, the way his father's presence filled a room with energy and authority. Yet he pushed the thought aside. His father needed rest, not responsibility. That was the story he repeated until it became truth. But the truth, like silk under tension, has a way of tearing. One afternoon, Ridge entered Eric's studio unannounced and found him sketching feverishly, his hands trembling as he fought against his own body. "You're killing yourself," Ridge snapped, and Eric looked up, eyes burning with fury. "No," he whispered, voice low but steady. "You are." It was not anger but exhaustion that followed, the exhaustion of years of misunderstanding, of a son too blinded by fear to see that his father's illness was not the worst thing that could happen. The worst thing was losing his purpose before his time. That confrontation left Ridge shaken. For the first time, he saw himself not as the protector but as the destroyer, the one smothering the flame he was meant to shield. Yet guilt did not immediately lead to change. He rationalized it again and again, telling himself that love sometimes required hard choices. But every night, he dreamed of his father's frail frame hunched over a sketchpad, each movement costing him breath, yet filled with more life than Ridge had felt in years. The dreams began to feel like confessions. Eric, meanwhile, wrestled with his own demons. The fear of being obsolete haunted him as much as the fear of dying. In his mind, he could still see the early days of Forrester Creations, the laughter, the chaos, the smell of new fabric and possibility. To let go of it now felt like erasing himself. But he also saw the pain in Ridge's face, the desperation of a son trying to hold on to a father who refused to fade quietly. The irony struck him. Both were fighting to save the other, and both were failing. As the week unfolded, Steffi became the fragile bridge between them. She reminded Ridge of what he had forgotten. That creativity was not a risk for Eric, it was survival. She spoke of how Finn believed that the mind's passion could heal the body in ways medicine could not. Ridge listened, torn between reason and faith. He could not deny the truth in her words, yet the image of his father collapsing haunted him still. It was easier to play the villain of restraint than to risk being the son who let his father die chasing a dream. The final breaking point came late one evening, when Eric collapsed while sketching alone. Steffi and Donna found him unconscious, his breath shallow, his pulse weak. Ridge arrived moments later, his world collapsing into chaos. For hours, the house became a storm of panic, paramedics rushing in, family members weeping, the hum of machines filling the silence that followed. When Eric awoke in the hospital, Ridge was at his side, his face pale, eyes hollow. "I thought I lost you," Ridge whispered. But Eric's reply was a rasp of defiance. "You already did." That night changed everything. Ridge saw what his control had cost. He had taken away not only his father's freedom, but the essence that made him Eric Forrester, the artist, the dreamer, the creator of beauty in a world that too often forgot how to see it. When Eric was discharged, Ridge made no speeches, no promises. Instead, he simply placed the sketchpad back in his father's hands. The gesture said what words could not. "I was wrong." Steffi watched as the distance between father and son slowly dissolved. She saw Ridge begin to collaborate again, this time as a partner, not a guardian. And she saw something even more miraculous. Eric's spirit reviving, his hands steadier, his eyes brighter. The studio came alive once more, humming with creativity. It was not a full recovery, but it was something better, a reconciliation between art and mortality, between love and freedom. In quiet moments, Steffi still confided in Finn. She spoke of how close they had come to losing Eric not to illness but to suffocation. Finn reminded her that love, at its best, was not control, it was trust. Watching Eric and Ridge at work, she saw that truth come to life. There were still days when Eric faltered, when his strength failed, but those moments no longer carried despair. They carried meaning. He was living on his own terms, and in doing so, he had taught them all something about the difference between survival and living. Ridge would never fully forgive himself for the time he tried to save his father by silencing him. But perhaps that was the lesson, the kind of guilt that humbles rather than destroys. It drove him to listen more, to let go of his arrogance, to understand that sometimes love demands courage, not control. The man who once tried to save Eric learned instead to walk beside him, even when the path led toward inevitable loss. And when the final days came, when Eric's health began to fade for real this time, he did not fade alone or forgotten. He sat surrounded by sketches, fabrics, and the people who had once tried to shield him from the world but had instead learned to share it with him. The house that had once felt like a tomb of memories now pulsed with gratitude, laughter, and tears. In those last moments, Ridge held his father's hand and whispered that he understood. Eric smiled faintly, the corners of his lips softening into peace. He had won, not by outliving time, but by living as himself until the very end. When the world later learned of his passing, tributes poured in from every corner of fashion and art. They called him a legend, a visionary, a man whose work transcended age. But for Ridge and Steffi, the legacy was something quieter and infinitely more profound. They had learned that love is not the act of protecting someone from their fate. It is walking with them toward it, with open eyes and an open heart. Even years later, Steffi would sometimes return to that old studio. The sunlight still filtered through the windows, the air still smelled faintly of thread and cedarwood, and she could almost hear her grandfather's voice guiding her. Ridge, older now, would join her in silence. Together, they would look at the sketches Eric left behind, each one a reminder that art, like love, is both fragile and eternal. And somewhere between those quiet walls, they both understood that Eric Forrester had never truly left them. He had simply become part of the light that filled the room. In the end, the truth that haunted them for so long revealed itself in the simplest way. Ridge had never meant to kill his father, and Eric had never wanted to be saved. They were two men bound by love and pride, each trying to protect the other from the one thing neither could control: time. And through that struggle, they had both created something timeless, the understanding that legacy is not about what we leave behind, but about how fiercely we live before we go.